On, Janielle. We record this, so in the event you feel like you need to share the good news of these webinars and the content and the information and knowledge being shared, that you have access to these on the Can Do website. So both Tuesday's webinar and then Wednesday Innovate BC webinar. So welcome. My name is Michelle. I'm joining from the beautiful crisp day here in Edmonton, Alberta, at Miskwachiwaskagan. I hope wherever you are that you are safe, that you are happy, you're healthy, and that you're doing well in the middle of the day. The sun is indeed shining, but maybe it's not shining in your part of Canada, you're part of this nation. But I hope that there's some, metaphorical sunshine happening in your world. I always think it's important just to take that moment and offer that gratitude. We never walk alone in Creator's world. So we're always supported. We're always surrounded by goodness. So we just want to take a moment to acknowledge, think of 3 things in your heart, 3 things that you're grateful for this day. Creator's good. So we give thanks for the gift of that sun rising in the east, Creator meeting us for a new day. Opportunity is always possibilities, learning, growing, just being who we are, is a gift in itself. So thank you for that sun rising in the east, Creator. The season is beginning to change. I don't know if you can tell that in your part of the world. But I've been noticing, I've been watching the animals, particularly the rabbits. So I'm thankful for all those gifts of land, the gift of other animals, the gift of our sacred waters, and the medicines that are going to be starting to grow again soon for us. So again, we give thanks to Creator for the gift of this world that we get to live and breathe and move and play and heal and grow and develop, our vision, our dreams and our plans. So it's awesome. It's an awesome day. So it's March 14th. It is International Pie Day, March 14th. So go have yourself a piece of pie later on. So today's a good day. So welcome to Can Do Links to Learning. So this is a really great opportunity for us just to gather in this virtual community, gather and learn and grow, build our own capacity, be inspired by the stories that are being shared. So thank you all so much for joining us. All right, so let's get on with it, shall we? So we got Jimmy Thunder here. He's been here before. So we're so honored that he's decided to come back and share his good knowledge. So he comes from the Sachigo Lake First Nation in Ontario. He's currently working as the Director of Economic Development for Norway House Cree Nation and also teaching Indigenous economic leadership at the University of Manitoba. He is a trained facilitator with the Indigenous Leadership Development Institute. I think it's always important just to hear, the strength that these presenters bring to the table. He's actively encouraging public engagement with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, which I think is so relevant and so important. And it's this living document that we still need to talk about and look at and, push forward. So as a result of public speaking in the context that he's been invited into post-secondary institutions and community organizations as a consultant on, matters related to cultural awareness, anti-racism, and inclusion, which is so important. So today he's going to talk about economic development strategic planning. So it will highlight the importance of strategic planning for economic development in a First Nation context. So information provided today is presented for the benefit of economic development officers, economic development directors, or elected First Nation leadership focusing on economic development. That's a whole lot of economic development, and I love it. That's why this is here. That's why we're here. So we are so, again, honored to have you, Jimmy. We welcome you. We come with an open mind and open heart, and we trust, we trust the knowledge that you're going to share. I think everybody's an expertise in their own right, in the corner of their own world. So we come here to listen to you. And so we're, again, honored. So welcome. Help me to, welcome this gentleman to our virtual webinar. I'm passing this mic to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michelle. That's one of the most incredible introductions I've ever had. So that's great. Second time around. So we're going to jump into it. Strategic planning today for Indigenous context, First Nation context. We already did a bit of an introduction. I am an MBA, Master of Business Administration, Certified Associate in Project Management, and Registered Professional Trainer with the Indigenous Leadership Development Institute. Sachico Lake First Nation is where I'm from, Treaty 9 territory. And we went through all of these others as well. So jumping right into it, I want to talk about the objectives for today. I want to highlight the importance of strategic planning. I want to describe how to indigenize strategic planning. And then lastly, I want to provide an overview of the strategic planning process. So that's what I want to accomplish today. I want to begin by highlighting the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. So I was on the phone with them the other day, and the name is a bit of a misnomer. They're going to be changing it and updating it. They're going to change American Indian to Indigenous, and they're going to add governance. So their new name, once it's changed, will be the Harvard Project on Indigenous Economic Development and Governance. But essentially what this is it's a collection of best practices and studies and research on Indigenous governance and economic development, not only in America, but worldwide. So they have research projects in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia. And with such a large scope of study, they're able to extrapolate common best practices. And so this is a quick summary of some of the top research that they found. If you look at successful economic development initiatives, they combine it to these 4 points. First is self-rule, which in Canada, we mostly say self-government. Number 2 is capable institutions of self-governance. And so this is things like having your structure in place, your policies, your procedures. A good model example is for economic development, you have the politics and your economic development entities separate. So you might have like a board of directors, and you might have an economic development corporation that's sort of separate, and you have all your entities under the economic development corporation. So that's an example. Number 3 is culturally appropriate approaches. So recognize our historical context, recognizing our culture, recognizing our values, and having that inform our decisions and our actions. And number 4, what we're talking about today is strategic orientation. So having a strategic plan. So looking at the long term, looking at how to be proactive rather than reactive, and executing a strategy. So that's one of the importance of having a strategy, is to move towards becoming one of these successful economic development stories. So I want to talk about, in the absence of a strategic plan, what happens? If you don't have a strategic plan, your objectives will change frequently. Your resources will become spread across too many projects to be manageable. Communication will be difficult with your employees, your managers. Directors and managers and staff will have misaligned priorities. In the absence of a strategic plan, everybody's going to have their own interpretation of what's the best use of their time and resources. And this becomes a bigger problem as the organization gets larger. So crises last longer because they're not prioritized, and morale could be low for a number of different reasons. People can maybe not see what direction that we're moving in together. Maybe people become overworked because the structure and plan doesn't deliver work or spread work across evenly evenly. Maybe there's no, human resource plan as part of the strategy. It could be a number of different things. But what happens if we have a plan? So if we have a strategic plan, it'll highlight short-term and long-term objectives, but it will remain flexible to adjustments. Situations change, plans change. Sometimes strategic planning happens at a quarterly, semi-annual, or annual basis where the plan needs to be updated. So just because you have a plan doesn't mean it's locked in stone, but it does mean that you're looking short-term and long-term. In the First Nations context, we have the 7 generations principle, which plans 7 generations ahead, and in terms of determining what decisions we make today. A strategic plan limits projects to existing or future capacity and resources. So it looks at what do we have today, what are the coming pots of money, what are the coming opportunities that will increase our capacity, and it will limit our work to what we actually have available to work with. A strategic plan facilitates communication between internal and external stakeholders. It creates alignment with all levels of the organization, so everybody knows what the priorities are and they know how to spend their time and resources. It prioritizes crises and immediate needs. So if there's a crisis going on or something that needs to be dealt with immediately, a strategic plan will prioritize those. And it increases morale. People are being developed, people know that there's a plan, and we're all moving in the same boat together. So I want to talk a bit about our context. So in Manitoba, we have the CED principles, the Community Economic Development Principles, and these are principles that are given to us in order to, as a bit of a strategy on sort of like the larger economic scale for the region. And these are principles in terms of how to build up our economy together collectively. So what I want to do in the next couple of slides is highlight how all of these principles have a correlating policy in the Indian Act. Whereas these principles are trying to build up our economy, the Indian Act has systematically worked to destroy our economy and to disadvantage us as First Nations as First Nations people. And it's important to begin by just highlighting that as a context. So one of the CED principles is, the use of local goods and services. The Indian Act created the permit system, the production of goods and services for local use. The Indian Act created the peasant farming system, local reinvestment of projects. The Indian Act created reserves, which made it difficult for reinvestment of projects. Long-term employment of local residents. Again, the Indian Act created that permit system, which limited the ability to create employment. Local skill development. So under the Indian Act, the enforced enfranchisement of First Nations people in university. If you got a degree, you were forcibly enfranchised. Local decision-making and ownership. The Indian Act enabled government to reclaim reserve lands and prohibited anyone from soliciting funds for First Nation legal claims. One of the principles is healthy people. The Indian Act introduced residential schools. Healthy physical environment. Under the Indian Act, the government could lease out uncultivated lands. Here's a note about UNDRIP, which we'll talk about later. And neighborhood stability. So the Indian Act created the pass system. So you're not allowed to leave or come to the reserve without a pass being filled out. Human dignity. The Indian Act forbade First Nations from speaking our own language. It forbade Western First Nations from appearing publicly in the regalia. Support for other CED principles. The Indian Act forbade First Nations from forming political organizations. So this is a quick overview. I just want to quickly highlight, and much more can be said on this topic, but to quickly illustrate the fact that we are in the context we are today specifically because of colonization and colonial policies that systematically prevented our economies from being developed. And this is also incredibly important knowledge for the non-Indigenous partners that we engage with, because they don't know a lot of this, and the lack of knowledge will influence how they interact with us. And we'll talk a little bit about more later in the presentation. But that third point of the Harvard project on Indigenous economic development talked about having a cultural approach. So this is the model developed by Salway Black in 1994. It's an example of an economic development success model. And so it uses the medicine wheel, which has sacred symbolism for many First Nations all across Turtle Island. And so here she measures different aspects of what successful economic development could be. And so in no particular order, we have the control of assets, we have spirituality being a component and a good outcome of successful economic development, kinship, which refers to all of our relations, not just us as people, but our relationship to land and animals and creation, all of creation, and personal efficacy, our ability to contribute to our community, our families, the relatives, in all of these others. So I bring this up just to illustrate that we have our own way of understanding what successful economic development is. And each First Nation will have their own way of viewing this. We'll have all of our own models of what success means to us. So it's good to take the time to think about what do we mean when we talk about success for economic development. And when we have a clear picture of what success means, that's going to inform our strategy. So now I want to talk about the process. So for strategic planning, it's very important to begin the process with some good data collection. And so in order to do that, you have to know where you're going to get the data from. So I'm highlighting here some potential sources of data collection. The first one I would say is internal documents. So look at previous strategic planning documents or organization charts. Maybe strategic planning has already been done by previous leadership, previous leader, and so on. So that those documents, even if you decide you don't want to follow them, could have some continuity of information and could be good sources of information. The second would be stakeholder interviews conducted with key people. So if you're looking at in the context of economic development, so you want to look at people like the portfolio holder, you want to look at maybe the director of your economic development corporation, you want to look at all the people who are currently doing some type of economic development and you conduct interviews with them. The third could be a community consultation. Community consultation could take place in which the community members can share their values, their hopes and goals at a community session or via surveys or some other way to collect input from the community at large. You could also research you do online research. So research on the First Nation could be conducted online using resources such as the First Nation community profiles, Statistics Canada, etc. You could also look at external research. What's the context that you find yourself in as a First Nation? So government funding reports, industry reports, and Indigenous strategic plans. So just to give you some ideas, it's not limited to this, but these are some places to start if you are doing some data collection for your strategic plan. Here's an example for those who haven't seen it yet. This is a First Nation community profile. Just chose Black River. This is the First Nation that I actually worked with when I was working for MNP. So you can find all kinds of information about demographics, and this can also inform your plan. I've also talked about external strategies. So this here is the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. It was created in 2002, and its vision was socioeconomic parity for Indigenous peoples all across Canada. It was developed by over 20 Indigenous organizations, and it was drafted by a smaller core group. So this is a living document. It's a work in progress, and it has an open call for Indigenous organizations to provide comments and suggestions. This was first launched in June 2022, so fairly new. As I mentioned, the purpose of that strategy is to close the socioeconomic gap. So the National Indigenous Economic Development Board estimates that closing the productivity gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians could lead to an increase of $27.7 billion to Canada's GDP each year. So in economic strategy, they do an excessive amount of research, and they have a very strong literature review at the beginning. And so this point rings true for everyone, that when Indigenous peoples do well, when First Nations do well, we all do well. And the report has the finances and the numbers to back it up. So it further describes that parity in education would lead to $8.5 billion in income each year. Parity in economic opportunities would lead to $6.9 billion in employment income, and 135,000 newly employed Indigenous peoples. Parity in poverty rates would reduce fiscal spending by $8.4 billion annually. And there's additional information and reports that could be found in this national plan. And one of the benefits from this is that when advocating with different levels of government, these statistics and figures could be cited as just to back up different strategic plans that you put forward and need funding and support for. So as an example of how this plan looks, the National Indigenous Economic Strategy has 107 calls for economic prosperity, and it's broken into 4 different sections: lands, people, finance, and infrastructure. So for example, the people section, it has 5 calls related to Indigenous entrepreneurship, 10 calls related to leadership and government, 8 for labor force and labor markets, 6 related to social capitals, which is the connection between people, organizations, and community, and 2 related to the workplace. And so all of the sections, finance, infrastructure, and lands, will follow the same structure. And this is essentially what the National Indigenous Economic Strategy is. Another piece that I want to talk about that should inform the strategy is Call to Action 92. And Call to Action 92 was given to us by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as one of the 94 calls to action. And it's interesting that here we are so many years later, and so many people still do not know what the 94 calls to action are. I find myself in different meetings with different contractors that want to do business with us. I'd like to ask them, so, what is your involvement with Call to Action 92, and what do you know about Call to Action 92? And, there's so many responses that say, oh, what is that? I haven't heard of that. Or, oh, that's not my role. That's not my policy. That's not what I'm here to do. And it's interesting because if you actually read it, and let's read it together, it's Call to Action 92 says, we call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt UNDRIP as the reconciliation framework. So UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which itself sets up the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide. So basically, this call to action is saying, yeah, we accept UNDRIP as a reconciliation framework, and we're going to apply its principles, its norms and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. And then it sort of breaks it down in terms of what exactly that means specifically. So this call to action is for the entire corporate sector. So if you're doing business with First Nations, then this especially applies to you. And I think the problem today is too many of us don't even ask them the question if they know about Call to Action 92, and if so, what are they doing about it? And it's a huge opportunity lost. So Call to Action 92, we would do well to let it inform our strategy. Right quickly, these 3 components here is basically ensuring that we have the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before moving forward. Number 2 is ensuring equitable access to jobs. And also, when we engage in business contracts, that our communities should gain long-term sustainable benefits. So if a lot of businesses will engage in business with us, and as a result of the contract, they will increase their own capacity to do more and to learn more. So our contracts should be structured such that our people also have their capacity enhanced as a result of these projects. And as I mentioned before, it's important that they understand the historical context. And that leads to point 3, provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples. So just like we talked about before, showing how the Indian Act has shaped our current context. So we wouldn't be doing business with them if it weren't for our colonial context and policies such as the Indian Act, just to name one. So that's incredibly important, and this would be a really valuable call to action to inform how we engage with external stakeholders. So just a quick look at how we're doing. So this is a sample of different companies that actually have statements in response to call to action 92. None of them have numerical KPIs, key performance indicators. Only two of them three of them mention the history, and in terms of their length of their statements, you can sort of see the length here and the number of commitments. So this is something that we should be holding companies that do business with us accountable to, because collectively we do have the ability to influence how they interact with us. Okay, so the strategic planning process. So we've looked at data. So what internal and external data is available to us. We've collected all of that. And so we begin with an initial strategy meeting. So we'll have maybe a team lead that will come and sort of gather all the data and facilitate it, and gather key members of the First Nation together. The strategic team lead will present the initial data and conduct a group engagement session. During this session, we'll ask things like, what are our major goals? What are the things that we really want to see in our First Nation? What do we understand economic development to be? It's like we talked about above with that slide. What is economic development? We all, even as individuals, we will understand and define it a little bit different. So if we come to that understanding of economic development together, that will align our strategy. What does success look like? So what are we trying to achieve together? During this strategic planning meeting, the strategic planning team would present their data and facilitate a discussion. They might do something like a SWOT analysis. So this here is a SWOT analysis example. We have the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the actual SWOT analysis would be a lot larger than this, be more than 3 bullet points in each of these categories. Strengths and weaknesses are internal. So these are internal to the First Nation and to do with current organizations, current entities, and so on. Opportunities and threats are external. So what is the external environment like? What is the business environment like? What are the policies that affect the environment in which we live? So in this example, I have some strengths. Maybe the First Nation has a younger demographic that's eager for training. Maybe the First Nation is FNFA certified. Maybe you have some band members that have reached CPA standing. Some weaknesses might be that majority of senior leadership are close to retirement. Maybe there's a lack of clarity about roles and departments. Maybe businesses are not centralized under a business development corporation. So the weaknesses present opportunities for us to work on, rectifying some of these things in the plan. A lot of people try to avoid weaknesses and they will try to rename weaknesses to something else, but it's important to include in our research. Opportunities. So again, opportunities are external. So maybe there's a new road project that's receiving government funding. Maybe there's a gold mine in exploration phase or some kind of a mine on traditional territory. A great example that we've all experienced was COVID-19. So maybe COVID-19 support available for Indigenous businesses back when when COVID-19 was more relevant. Some threats. COVID-19 has impacted the economy. That's another example we can all relate with. Maybe severe cold warnings. Maybe government policy has changed some policies that will directly impact the First Nation. So this is an example of a SWOT analysis, and done well, this could really inform strategy. So once all that's done, once you've gathered all the information, once you've done that initial planning meeting, you've defined overall goals, then it gets to the point where we facilitate this 5-point process. So the first is to define goals. Second is to brainstorm some projects. Third is to prioritize the projects. Fourth is to assign those projects. And fifth is to measure those projects. So very quickly, that's the overall view of the approach. And I'll break it down each one. So the first one, define the overall goals or objectives. So you might review the data, including the SWOT analysis, and then you'll come together and say, what are some high-level goals or changes that you would want to see? So for example, you might want to see higher employment. You might want to see a stronger workforce. You might want to see improved infrastructure. And you might be more or less specific as you put these goals out. After all of these goals have been listed, look for potential areas of overlap or grouping. So as you're brainstorming, you're writing this down somewhere. Maybe it's on a whiteboard, maybe you have poster paper up, but you're getting all the ideas up there, everything. And once you've had a sufficient amount of time, you look for potential areas of overlap, different ways you can group this together. And once you're okay, once everyone is sort of in agreement and consensus, then you're left with your major goals. And so you want to keep this to a manageable number. So maybe 4 to 6, something that you can meaningfully work with for the following stages. So secondly, once that's done, you want to brainstorm specific projects that would contribute to meeting these goals. So it's important to note that a project is different than a goal in that a project can be given a specific start and end date. So goals are these big objectives that will probably take decades and decades to, some of them might take decades and decades to actually achieve meaningfully, but a project can be measured. It'll have a specific start date. A project will have a specific end date. A project will be assigned very specific resources. It can be given a budget, a staff, and so on. And it has KPIs, key progress indicators. It can be measured. So we've established our goals. So now we're doing the same thing, and we're brainstorming as many projects as we can related to these goals. So the goals might be headings, and underneath all the headings, you might have all these projects, and you keep going and you keep throwing the projects out. Some of them might have been started already. Some of them have been talked about. You just throw everything out and record all the ideas as they come. So you list all the possible projects in a visible area, such as a whiteboard or on poster paper. As you list, don't worry about your available resources, just focus on meeting the objectives. Just ask yourself the question, does this project contribute to the meeting of that goal? And if it does, then just write it down. Ensure you have each project listed under each goal. So you want to make sure that the project's written and the goals that are above them have that alignment. Once you've done that, you prioritize all the projects. So you've brainstormed all the goals, you've grouped them up, you've put them as category headings, you've thrown all the projects onto the wall underneath. So now it's time to prioritize. So you recognize that you can't do everything. You're probably, even as you go through the process, people might feel overwhelmed at the amount of work and the needs and limited resources that might hit everybody at that process. So you got to prioritize. You have to realize that you can't do everything. So you just decide what's important. Depending on the size of the group, you might need the following method in order to get it done quickly. So this is a method that we've used. You might give each participant 8 red stickers and 8 green stickers. And this will depend, the number of stickers given might vary depending on the amount of projects that are on the wall and the number of participants. But basically the idea is that the red stickers indicate the highest priority and the green stickers are the second highest priority. And you explain that each participant is going to be given time to select 8 projects that matter the most to them. And they can give 1 sticker to one, they can give more than 1 sticker if that project is important, So they go throughout, they look at all the goals, they have 8 to choose from, and they put the red dots next to the projects that they feel are the most important. And one thing to note here is that they must choose a project and not the goal on the very top, because we've seen it where somebody was trying to, stretch out the red dot by choosing a goal instead of the project. So that was clever, but yeah, you want to make sure that the dot corresponds to the project. So after they've done the red dots, they could take the green And then the green dots are the second priority, and you sort of do the same thing. And if you feel really strongly about one project, you can get a couple of green dots next to that project. And so once all the stickers are labeled, you could go back and just look for patterns, look for clusters. So you might say, there's a need for a new hospital, for example. And after everyone has sat down and they're looking at your project listing, you might see, that there might be 20 red dots on that hospital. It's a pretty high priority. You might see a cluster of green on developing a new workforce, developing the workforce, or an entrepreneurship project, for example. So that could be a really quick way in one session to come to agreement on what the priorities of the nation actually are. So after you've done that, then you would assign scope, timeline, and project leads. So each project will need a scope. So we'll need to know how many years will be required to complete each project. Number two, when do we want the project to start? So what year, what quarter, depends how specific you want to be. Number three, who will be responsible for the project? Who's going to be the project lead for each project? During this draft, take note not to overburden any staff or team member. Spread the project start times according to priority. So you might notice that one individual in your team is just getting a whole bunch of projects assigned to them. Make sure that person has the capacity, has maybe the team or the department able to execute that project. Number three, after the strategic planning session, project management resources should be used to further refine the plan to ensure projects can be completed on time or on budget. This process, this strategic planning session as outlined, it creates a good outline of what we want, and it has a good method of limiting projects, but you want to also do that further research to make sure that you have the budget and the resources to move according to the plan as defined. Lastly, is to define what key performance indicators will be used. And so key performance indicators are just what are the things that you're going to measure to ensure that you're actually achieving the objective. So in order to record the degree of success within each project, you will need to find metrics that can be measured related to the project goals. So for example, employment rate could be recorded by the entities owned by the First Nation. Unemployment rate as recorded by the social department, and so on. So different things that you can measure over time that shows that your project is actually being successful and it's meeting the goals that you want. And so a quick example could be that maybe you have, you've gone through the exercise and you've defined together what economic development actually means for your First Nation. Maybe you've thrown into three categories. Maybe you've defined community economic development as one of your pillars. You want to focus on the people. You want to focus on the social side of things. Maybe secondly, you want major business investments. You want to look at the urban economy. You want to look at investing in infrastructure projects and so on. And maybe third is you want to really focus on partnerships with government and associations. Maybe this is sort of what you've decided together. And under each of these categories, you have defined subcategories, so under community economic development, maybe it's building the local economy, it's getting those entrepreneurs supported, and maybe it's attracting talent to the First Nation. Maybe it's just business retention and expansion. So this could be an example of an outcome of the process. This is what maybe one First Nation could define together as economic development. And that will create the alignment that you need for executing the rest of the strategy. Here's another example of an outcome. So maybe one of your goals was to increase the success of various types of employers for First Nation citizens on and off reserve, including for-profit, nonprofit, band-owned, band office, and crown corporations. Maybe that's a goal. And an example of metrics or KPIs, you want to measure your number of social clients. You want to measure your employment rate, the number of businesses that exist in your First Nation. An example project that can help you reach this could be an entrepreneurship program. Maybe you develop an entrepreneurship program together. And for example, team lead, maybe your director of economic development or executive officer could be the team lead, and the time required. Maybe this program could be established in 6 months. So the program itself will be in existence in perpetuity, but the project is developing the program in the first place. But yeah, this is an example of the outcome of the process of, you know, one example project meeting an example goal with metrics, a team lead, and a time frame. So as I come to a close here, I also want to highlight this template. So the template that I'm going to be giving here is going to be free to use for anybody attending the session. If you register, then you'll get a copy of this in Microsoft Word, and yeah, and it'll just be a tool that you can use to go through the process yourself. So basically, the way that this works is after you've gone through the project priority setting exercise, you know, the one with all of the stickers and everything, you'll end up with your projects listing according to your priority number. So you might have a number of projects that are listed according to project name, and then you'll write the scope next to it, how many years will be required for each project to be completed. You can create a quick high-level estimated cost of what that project might be. You can further verify it later, and then a description of what the project is. Each project will then have some KPIs, you know, just as was mentioned in the example above. So what performance indicators will measure the success of the project, who owns the project, who's going to be the project lead, and target date. So when do you want to start the project, or alternatively, when do you want to finish the project? So this is how you would take all that data, how you would record it, and it would be part of your strategic plan at the very end. In addition to this, once you have all of your projects listed, then this template is also available for you. And this is the project management template. So basically, each project can be broken down into deliverables, and each deliverable can be broken into tasks. And then tasks can be assigned to people, and they can be given deadlines. And it's just a way of making sure that what your plan says actually comes through on a day-to-day basis. So every day, if you're plugging away at the tasks, and then you can be sure that you actually will reach the projects that you set out to do in your strategic plan. This template is also available for everybody. So you would write your project name at the top, your deliverable. The template comes with multiple deliverables. You would just break down with how many deliverables you would need in order to complete the project. There'll be a description of each deliverable. There would be a person responsible and a timeline. And so every deliverable then would have their tasks. Tasks are the smallest units of work. As you fill out the template, you can opt to give each task its own line by repeating the deliverable in the first line, and so on. Task dependencies. Sometimes you cannot complete a task until you complete another task before it. And so this project template will note the task dependencies. It'll note the person responsible for each task, give you a timeline, and some additional comments if you need. So yeah, like I mentioned, this template is available for anybody who would like to use it. You could also use software that will do the exact same thing. You can go to things like monday.com or Asana or ClickUp. It will do the exact same thing that these templates are doing. You can also look at Microsoft Project as well. If you have somebody on your team who is interested in learning, and especially if they're interested in pursuing project management training through PMI, maybe they're CAPM or PMP. Yeah, so with that will conclude my presentation, and I will open up for any questions.
Jimmy, you covered so much ground in 40 minutes. How did you do it? That was great. Right off the hop, we have Bonnie. She has a question. She raised her hand. Come on in, Bonnie.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. It was a real good overview and a reminder when we're introduced into a new company and we want to analyze, what they've got going on. And you listed such great little tidbits to go first. What do we've got for documents, or where's the research locally? But I want to ask, at what point would you be recommending paid information that would be valuable? So, something to consider once you've gone through all these resources. Where would you see it's appropriate to start looking outside to pay for some sort of data, or not a contractor to do the work? Just where else is there information that you found valuable that's actually a paid research?
Okay, for specifically in the context of strategic planning, right? Like on the data gathering phase, where would be a good source of paid data? And you're saying not necessarily a contractor? That is a good question. I think so far in my context, you can get a lot of data that's free, because a lot of the time the people in the community have the information. It's kind of like, let me borrow your watch and tell you what time it is, kind of a thing. I've heard that expression before, so I think a lot of times it's a matter of just interviewing the right people in the community, getting that data, and that's extremely useful. In terms of like, your outside of things like your context, I would say, I would hesitate to pay, especially a non-Indigenous contractor, to do some data gathering. I like, sometimes it is useful to hire an Indigenous consultant to do some data gathering for you, but with enough search and practice, you can find some good things. I would use a tool I would recommend for external data gathering is something called Porter's 5 Forces. And if you just do a quick Google of Porter's 5 Forces in your data gathering phase for economic development, you just look under each category and that will just point you where to Google, So yeah, I wouldn't recommend personally, paying for a lot of it. I think there's a lot of data that you have access to just by searching and asking people.
Great, really great news. If you wouldn't mind writing that in the chat so we can all take a look at that at some point. I'm not exactly sure. I've never seen that. And I guess after what you've said there, the expense would maybe be setting up the key stakeholder meetings and perhaps some cultural food and whatever is appropriate at the time to share and give, because you're going to be given information and it's got to be 2 ways, right?
I think that's true. There will be a cost associated with project strategic planning, no matter who does it, because whoever's doing it, whether it's internal or external, First Nation or non-First Nation, it's going to be work, and if it's done well, you sort of get what you pay for, kind of a thing. But my big thing in terms of sharing these templates is like our First Nation people can do it, like sometimes you just need a tool and you need the template and you just run with it and you get better with it as you do it. The more you do it, the more you get better at it. So, but it is going to take time, but I think it's best if we, if we can, to have our people do it rather than having external non-Indigenous companies do it.
Thank you so much.
For sure.
All right. I don't know if you noticed in the chat box, Jimmy, that
Yep.
someone asked about the resources you mentioned.
What resource you mentioned? Monday.com. Yeah. So Monday.com is that's one of the resources. Maybe I'll type it out. Asana is another one. ClickUp is another one. And Microsoft Project is another one. So Asana, Monday.com, and ClickUp, those are all very similar. And those have a low learning curve for project management. If you're new to project management and don't have a background in it, I would recommend Monday.com so far between the 3 of those. And then Microsoft Project is more, if you're really going to dig deep into project management and you want to be able to talk the lingo of your contractors, specifically your construction contract managers, that would be a good long-term investment if you have somebody who's keen to learn it, especially if they're being certified with PMI. I would go for that. It's a really good tool to keep track of your expenses, your timelines. It can create quick Gantt charts. So it's the very best of project management software is Microsoft Project.
Great. All right. And also he mentions that those of you who registered, so you're here, so that means you registered, you also will be sent the PowerPoint presentation that he delivered today. So that will be sent to your inbox, I think later on today or tomorrow. So you will have that resource as well. Brandon says, great presentation, good information. Thank you. I'm new to EDO, so that was very educational. Love it, love it. Also, I think Ken, let's go back to Ken asked a question about the 7 generations. Can you perhaps expand on that?
Right, 7 generations. I don't know if 7 generations is meant to be a numerical calculation. I'm pulling that from, I think, our friends in Ontario. I think the Haudenosaunee, I think, is one of the places where I think we got it from, and I think it comes from the Great Binding Law, which roughly is something like, in every deliberation, consider the impact on the 7th generation, even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future nation. That's a rough translation of their law. And so I don't know if it's meant to be like an actual literal number. I think it's more of, those who haven't been born yet will be affected by what we do today, like far beyond our lifespan. And I think that's the difference, because in non-Indigenous people, when they look at economics, they look at things like, return on investment, like and return on investment is like, what, quarters, maybe a year, a couple of years. That's how we measure our success. But as Indigenous people, we've always thought way longer than that. And so that's one of the differences. That's how you indigenize economic development and strategic planning, is that longer impact, so even when the treaties were negotiated, they were negotiated with us, generations and generations ahead. So I think that's more of the interpretation of the principle rather than a specific time frame.
Yeah, you captured that very well. Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions for our guest speaker today? The floor is open. Come on in, put it in the chat box. If you are shy, we'd love to hear from you. I always like to, it pains my heart whenever we revisit that Indian Act, but it's really good to see how far we have come, how far we have fought to get to where we are today. And that's just a testimonial to who we are as a people and what is possible, and you were talking about economic development in every nation and perhaps organization. Success is different. So you define what is successful for your people, your nation, your organization. And I love that empowerment. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Michelle, I also wanted to add, that last statement you had said, Jimmy, in regards to the Indigenous think in those generations, or in such a large fathomable amount of years that a non-Indigenous company is not looking at. And so I hope I will remember that. And unless you have another way of saying it, for when I'm in meetings and they're asking, like, why does it take so long to make a decision? What is the holdup? We've discussed this 3 or 4 times, and perhaps explaining it in a meaningful way, which you just briefly touched on, might bring some insight.
I think they need to do a whole reset in terms of how they think. And so call to action 92, the subsection 3 is for management and training for them. And that's not just like their frontline staff, which some of them try to get away with. It's up to their board of directors need to get that training. So I think that they need that full awareness. And so there's resources out there. There's Bob Joseph's 21 Things I Did Not Know About the Indian Act, Working Effectively with Indigenous Peoples. Those resources exist and they need to be reading them, and they're not going to read them if we don't push them to do it. The other thing is, in our case at Norway House, we're developing a Call to Action 92 awareness program where we're getting our contractors to pay us to teach them about all these different sections. And I also teach at the university or at Horizon College and Seminary. That's a 30 credit hour course that is just introduction of everything that's written in Call to Action 92 subsection 3, histories and all of the awareness that's necessary. So there's a lot of teaching that needs to be done because they need to understand our whole context, and it's just a foreign world to them. So that's another opportunity. If we can sort of, get them to hire us, and if in order to do business with us, you have to be certified by us by Call to Action 92. So then it opens the door for hours and hours of training to get them to understand the context and how they should be relating to us.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Call Action 92. That's researchable as well.
Yep. You can Google that. It's there's a lot of companies that have created, Indigenous companies that have created Call to Action 92 certification and training programs.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in the chat, it's Bob Joseph, 21 Things. Bob Joseph has a lot of good resources out there as well too. I recommend checking out his work.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book and very practical. So I highly, and a really easy read as well. So highly recommend that book. All right. Well, what a great presentation. What a great conversation. Jimmy, thank you so much for lending your valuable time to come and just, bring your good knowledge to this table. So thank you, everybody. Oh, and so in the chat box, someone's dropping a link there. So some good resources right now in the chat box as well. So make note of those. And again, we're so thankful that you're able to share your knowledge. You all will receive today's presentation in your email. So look out for that. Thank you all for joining us. Really important conversation. Take care. Yeah. And that Indigenous corporate training. Yes. With Bob Joseph. Yeah,
last one, like my website, reconciliationthunder.org. Yeah, that's it's not specifically for the corporate world, it's for everyone, but hey, check out those resources too.
Awesome. There you go. Another resource. Woo! Love it. Okay. Well, everybody go celebrate who you are today. Have a piece of pie. But also as you walk in Creator's World, just, extend that good gratitude, that good medicine from your heart. Again, we do not walk in Creator's World alone. And we don't walk in Creator's World for ourselves. It's that 7 generations. We think of, the kids who haven't even been born yet. What legacy are we leaving for those kids? All right. So be well, everyone, and we'll see you again. Take care.